So we're going to add a ton of detail to our scene using custom materials, and we've actually been working with materials already. Materials are basically the surface quality of different objects within Unity. We've used materials a little bit within Maya. For instance, we created our custom texture, which was one component of a larger material. And we talked a little bit about how materials also have this sort of shader component, which then determines a bunch of other components, and there's things like color maps and different channels and yada yada yada. In this case, every object, every 3D model within our scene has a material down here in the components that can be twirled and expanded, and we can view its properties. Now, you'll notice they're all grayed out by default. We can't edit these. This is because they have an existing preset that they're using, and we need to just generate a new preset. So the best way to do that is just to right-click a material. So I'm going to start by editing the material on my, my cube over here, my floating texture. I'm going to right-click it and say Create Material Preset. And what that's going to do is generate a new material called Cube1, or whatever your object's name is. I'll just call this My First Material or something like that. And I can just click and drag and drop to apply that onto my model. Alternatively, if I have my model selected, I can drag and drop it over here. So that material's been applied, that new preset, and now you'll notice none of this is grayed out. I can actually edit all of these options, and there's a ton of options in here. Different shader properties. We're actually going to be using the standard shader, so just make sure that it says standard. The Autodesk Interactive is the one that comes in from Autodesk by default, from Maya. There's other shaders within this. You can play around with those. I'm just going to stick with the standard shader. That's really all that you need now that Unity is so robust with its standard physics-based shader. So we have the rendering mode. We can say it's opaque, or we could say it's a transparent object, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. Here we have all the different maps. So this is the albedo map. An albedo map basically means a color map with an alpha or transparency quality to it. So by default, our albedo map is this brick texture and the little squiggly drawing that we made in Photoshop. And we can actually see a little preview of that here. If I click that, it highlights it in my assets panel. If I wanted to swap this albedo map, I could click that little circle next to it. The circle will bring up a browser showing me all the different possibilities built into Unity, which these are just a kind of a bunch of preset things. But I can always just pick my texture one. That's the one that I really want for now. But let's say I built another map. I could import that and assign it this way. I can also click this color wheel over here for the albedo map, and this will let me tint an object, even if it already has a map associated with it. And also, this is where, under the A list, we can change the alpha of our albedo map, meaning we can make our object transparent. So if I change my rendering mode to transparent, it's going to take this alpha into account. Over here it's completely opaque, and down here it's completely invisible. But we can start making some cool, transparent, ghostly objects. I'm going to switch that back to opaque for now. Below that we have a metallic channel. As I enhance that, it's going to create a more metallic reflection on my object. We have a smoothness. As I increase that, reflections are going to be more crisp, more smooth on them. You can see the sun kind of over here. Normal maps and height maps we haven't talked about yet. We'll be talking about those in a future video. And then we can also make an object emissive, meaning it will emit light from it. We can tile a texture. So for instance, I could tile this texture. So if I was bringing in another texture, I might want to tile it. In this case, it doesn't really work, so I'll just put that back to 1. And then we have a full secondary set of maps that we can assign as well. So we could add an additional albedo map here, an additional image onto our model, and kind of overlay them. So this is really cool, but let's make our own shader for our own material rather, for the rest of our scene. I go back into my assets and I'll just right click and say Create Material. And I'll call this ground material. And I'm going to be using the standard shader in opaque mode. I'm going to give it a little bit of a color here. I like this preview window down here, which you can actually change by clicking the little sphere. And this looks pretty solid to me, so I'm going to just drag and drop this onto some of my objects in my scene. If I want to create a new iteration of this, I can always duplicate this, just Command D, and start modifying it further so I can make more metallic. Oh, I'm editing the original. Let's edit this one. Could duplicate it again. Maybe this time I'll make it a different color completely. And I'll put that on my walls. So you can see how we can easily start coloring our scene and creating some really dynamic materials that look very, very, very professional. I can start knocking these things around and get some interesting effects off of the lights and stuff that we have in our scene. The materials are going to be the #1 way that you're going to add detail to your scenes. We haven't talked about normal maps yet. We'll be getting to that next week. But that's the other way that you're going to be adding a ton of detail to your models. But for now, just look at these great materials and just start playing around with them and customizing them and seeing what kinds of cool things you can create.